The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast a freezing, brilliant glare over the engagement party. 200 of the city's elite watched as the groom-to-be snickered, leaning into the microphone to make a passing joke about his fiancée's charming discount rack upbringing. The crowd erupted into polite, mocking laughter. She stood there, cheeks burning, clutching a vintage handbag they all assumed was a cheap knockoff. They had no idea that the tarnished crest on its clasp belonged to a sovereign wealth fund worth $80 billion. By midnight, their laughter would die, replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence. Declan Prescott was the kind of man who wore his wealth like a weapon. As the sole heir to Prescott Global, a colossal shipping and real estate empire, his life had been a meticulously curated exhibition of excess. He drove imported cars that cost more than most suburban homes, wore custom-tailored suits woven from vicuña wool, and spent his weekends at the family's sprawling estate in the Hamptons. And then there was Sophie. Sophie Bennett was a paradox that Declan's high society circle could never quite decipher. They had met 6 months prior at a historical archives library where she worked as a senior restorer. Declan, entirely out of his element, was there to sign off on a tax-deductible donation his father was making to the city. He had been instantly captivated by her. She was quietly beautiful, with dark, observant eyes and an air of absolute tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the loud, desperate socialites he usually dated. But to the Prescott family, Sophie was nothing short of a disaster. "She is a charity case, Declan," his mother Veronica Prescott had hissed during one of their private family dinners, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux. Veronica was a woman made of sharp angles and cold calculation, draped in diamonds that felt more like armor than jewelry. "She lives in a 4th-floor walk-up in a borough I wouldn't even send my driver to. Her clothes look like they were pulled from a grandmother's attic." "What on earth are you thinking?" "She keeps me grounded, Mother," Declan had replied, though his tone lacked the conviction of a man defending the love of his life. "It's charming. She doesn't care about the money." "Nobody doesn't care about money," his father Ryder had muttered from behind his newspaper. "She's playing a long game, mark my words." Despite his parents' venomous disapproval, Declan proposed. He liked the idea of being the white knight, rescuing the humble archivist from her mediocre life. He liked how she looked at him without the calculating, gold-digging glint he was so used to seeing in women. What Declan failed to realize was that Sophie didn't care about his money because to her, his family's wealth was little more than pocket change. Sophie's full name was not Sophie Bennett. It was Princess Sophia Isabella Valois, the eldest and only direct heir to the sovereign duchy of Lorraine, an ancient European principality nestled between the borders of France and Switzerland. The Duchy of Lorraine was not just old money, it was foundational money. Her family owned vast swaths of European real estate, controlled centuries-old banking institutions, and possessed a private art collection that rivaled the Louvre. Sophie had fled to America to escape the suffocating weight of the crown. Her grandfather, the reigning Grand Duke, had given her 2 years of absolute anonymity. 2 years to live as a commoner, to work a normal job, to understand the world without the filter of royal privilege before she was summoned back to take her place in the line of succession. She had fallen for Declan because he had seemed genuinely interested in her mind, in her passion for history. But as the engagement ring, a flashy, gaudy 10-carat diamond that Declan had picked out specifically to show off, slipped onto her finger, the fairy tale began to rot. Declan's grounded fascination with her quickly morphed into embarrassment. He began criticizing her wardrobe, subtly suggesting she let his mother's stylist upgrade her look. He would grimace when she opted for public transit, instead of letting his security detail drive her. The man who had once found her simplicity charming was now desperate to mold her into a shiny, acceptable accessory for his ruthless world. And tonight, at the Prescott's annual Winter Charity Gala, which doubled as their official engagement party, that embarrassment was going to reach a boiling point. The ballroom of the St. Regis was transformed into a winter wonderland, dripping in white orchids and imported ice sculptures. The guest list read like a who's who of the financial elite. This was Veronica Prescott's domain, and she had orchestrated the evening with the strategic precision of a military general. Her first strike had been the dress. 3 days before the gala, Veronica had a large garment bag delivered to Sophie's apartment. A welcome gift to the family, the attached card read. Wear it tonight. We must ensure you look the part. When Sophie unzipped the bag, she had actually laughed out loud. It was a horrendous salmon pink gown made of stiff taffeta, layered with excessive ruffles that looked like they belonged in a terrible 1980s prom movie. It was deliberately hideous, meant to make her look completely out of place among the sleek, modern couture the other women would be wearing. Sophie, however, did not panic. She had spent her entire childhood around the world's most elite seamstresses. Armed with a pair of fabric scissors and a needle, she spent 2 nights meticulously deconstructing the gown, removing the grotesque ruffles, altering the neckline into a sleek, elegant plunge, and tailoring it to fit her frame perfectly. When Sophie arrived at the gala, Veronica's eyes narrowed into terrifying slits. The dress was still salmon pink, but Sophie wore it with such effortless, regal grace that she looked like a vintage Hollywood starlet. But Veronica had a backup plan. Enter Genevieve Sinclair. Genevieve was a banking heiress, a statuesque blonde dripping in real rubies, and Declan's on-again, off-again ex-girlfriend. Veronica had personally invited her, ensuring she was seated at the head table, directly across from Declan and Sophie. As the night wore on, the champagne flowed and the masks began to slip. Declan abandoned Sophie at their table to mingle with his college friends, Brooks, Carter, and Preston, a trio of trust fund heirs who shared Declan's specific brand of polished arrogance. Sophie sat quietly, sipping her water, listening as Genevieve leaned across the table. "It's so brave of you to show up here," Genevieve said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I mean, this world. It must be incredibly overwhelming for someone from your background. Declan tells me you repair old books for a living." "I restore historical documents," Sophie replied evenly, her voice betraying zero emotion. "Fascinating." Genevieve smirked, glancing at Sophie's hands. She noticed the rings Sophie was wearing on her right hand. Sophie had left Declan's gaudy 10-carat diamond at home, claiming it needed resizing. Instead, she wore a deeply personal family heirloom, a heavy, slightly tarnished gold band set with a raw, unpolished, dark sapphire. To the untrained eye, it looked like costume jewelry. To a jeweler, it was a priceless 14th-century artifact, once worn by a medieval queen. "Is that your engagement ring?" Genevieve asked loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "It's very rustic." Declan, hearing the commotion, walked over with his friends in tow. "What's going on?" Declan asked, wrapping an arm around Genevieve's chair rather than Sophie's. "We were just admiring Sophie's jewelry," Genevieve laughed softly. "She decided not to wear the ring you bought her. She prefers this little trinket." Brooks leaned in, squinting at the sapphire. "Looks like something you pull out of a cereal box, Dick. Did she buy it at a flea market?" The men chuckled, Sophie looked up at Declan, her dark eyes piercing. This was the moment. This was the test. All he had to do was tell them to stop. All he had to do was defend the woman he supposedly loved. Instead, Declan let out a nervous, booming laugh, running a hand through his expensive hair. "Hey, don't be too hard on her," Declan grinned, playing to his audience. "She insists it's a precious family heirloom, probably passed down from a long line of incredibly proud coal miners. You know how it is. They hold on to these little scraps to feel connected to history. It's a charity case, but it keeps me grounded." The table erupted into cruel, unapologetic laughter. Veronica, watching from a few feet away, smiled a thin, victorious smile over the rim of her champagne flute. Sophie did not cry. She did not blush. The warm, loving light that had existed in her eyes whenever she looked at Declan extinguished instantly, replaced by a cold, centuries-old, aristocratic ice. She slowly stood up, smoothing the skirt of her altered dress. "You are right, Declan," Sophie said, her voice carrying an eerie, perfectly modulated calmness that immediately cut through the laughter. It is a family heirloom, but I assure you my ancestors never mined coal." "Oh, come on, babe, it was a joke," Declan muttered, his smile faltering slightly at the chilling tone in her voice. "Sit down, don't make a scene." "I have no intention of making a scene," she replied coldly. "I simply realize now that I've drastically overstayed my welcome in your world." Before Declan could reach out to grab her arm, the heavy, brass-studded oak doors of the St. Regis ballroom swung open with a violent, echoing crack. The string quartet, which had been playing a soft Mozart piece in the corner, abruptly stopped. The murmurs of the elite crowd died in their throats. Standing in the doorway was a phalanx of 6 men. They were not hotel security. They wore immaculate midnight blue suits, their postures rigidly military, and each bore a subtle silver lapel pin shaped like a roaring lion, the crest of the sovereign duchy of Lorraine. Leading them was an older gentleman with silver hair, a sharp, aristocratic jawline, and a bespoke tuxedo that made Declan's tailor look like an amateur. He carried a leather briefcase stamped with a heavy wax diplomatic seal. "What is the meaning of this?" Ryder Prescott boomed, stepping forward to intercept the intruders. "This is a private closed event. Security, remove these men immediately." The hotel security guards rushed forward, but one of the men in the midnight blue suits simply reached into his breast pocket and flashed a black leather credential wallet. The hotel guards stopped dead in their tracks, their faces draining of color, and immediately stepped back, hands raised in surrender. The silver-haired man ignored Ryder Prescott completely. He did not even look at him. His eyes swept the ballroom with hawkish intensity until they landed on the woman in the salmon-pink dress standing near the head table. With measured, purposeful strides, the man walked across the marble floor. The crowd parted for him instinctively, sensing an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. Declan, bewildered, took a step back as the man approached. The silver-haired man stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Sophie. The 6 security operatives formed a defensive perimeter around them, effectively blocking Declan, Genevieve, and Veronica from getting any closer. The room was so silent you could hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses. The man clicked his heels together, slowly, deliberately. He bowed. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, formal, courtly bow of absolute subservience. "Your Royal Highness," the man's voice rang out, rich and carrying a faint, refined European accent. "Forgive the intrusion, but your grandfather's health has taken a sudden turn. The Regency Council has been convened. The 2 years are up." Sophie's posture shifted. The meek, quiet archivist vanished. In her place stood a woman who looked like she was born to rule empires. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes locking onto the older man. "Is he stable, Chancellor Frederick?" she asked. Her voice was no longer the soft, unassuming tone Declan knew. It was sharp, commanding, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "He is resting, Your Highness," Chancellor Frederick replied, straightening up. "But the private jet is idling on the tarmac at JFK. The diplomatic escort is waiting outside. It is time to come home, Princess." Princess. The word hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Declan's face went entirely slack. His jaw actually dropped. He looked from Chancellor Frederick to the woman he had just publicly humiliated. "Princess," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Sophie." "What? What is this?" Chancellor Frederick finally turned his gaze to Declan. The look of utter disgust on the Chancellor's face was so potent it made Declan physically recoil. "You will address Her Royal Highness, Princess Sophia Isabella Valois, crown heir to the sovereign Duchy of Lorraine, with the respect her station demands." Frederick snapped, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. "Though, given the reports my intelligence officers have provided regarding your abhorrent behavior tonight, I suggest you do not address her at all." Veronica Prescott let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her diamond necklace. The Duchy of Lorraine. Even the new money Prescotts knew that name. It was the kind of wealth that bought and sold companies like Prescott Global for sport. Declan was trembling now, a sick, horrifying realization washing over him. The cheap, dark sapphire ring his friends had just mocked. It was the Lorraine sovereign seal. "Sophie, please," Declan stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised pleadingly. I didn't know. Babe, I was just joking earlier. You know I love you. We're getting married." Sophie turned to look at him. The sheer pity in her eyes was worse than if she'd slapped him. "We are not getting married, Declan," she said softly, but her voice carried through the silent room. "I spent 2 years looking for a man who valued character over currency. For a brief moment, I thought I had found him in you. But you are just like the rest of them. Actually, you are worse. You lack the courage of your own convictions, bending to the sneers of your mother and the mockery of your friends." She reached into her vintage handbag, the one they had all laughed at, and pulled out the heavy 10-carat diamond ring he had given her. She didn't hand it back to him. She simply dropped it into his half-empty champagne glass with a hollow clink. "Keep the ring," she whispered. "Perhaps you can sell it to keep your father's logistics company afloat after the duchy withdraws its investments from your primary financial backers on Monday morning." Ryder Prescott let out a loud, choking cough from the back of the room as the financial death sentence was delivered. "Chancellor," Sophie commanded, not looking at Declan again, "we are leaving." "At once, Your Highness," Frederick replied. The security detail moved in perfect synchronization, escorting her out of the ballroom. As she walked, the crowd of billionaires and socialites instinctively bowed their heads and stepped back, a path clearing for the true royalty they had spent the entire evening mocking. The financial world does not bleed. It simply erases. At exactly 8 a.m. on Monday, the trading floors of Wall Street were humming with their usual frantic, caffeinated energy. By 8:15 a.m., the Bloomberg terminals on the top floor of Prescott Global headquarters in Manhattan began to flash with a terrifying, synchronized urgency. Ryder Prescott stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Hudson River, sipping a cup of single-origin espresso. He was exhausted. The weekend had been a nightmare of PR spin and frantic phone calls after the catastrophic scene at the St. Regis. He had spent 48 hours trying to convince his board of directors that the woman who had publicly humiliated his son and threatened his company was just a delusional, disgruntled ex-fiancée. "She's an archivist, for God's sake," Ryder had yelled at his chief financial officer on Sunday night. "She repairs old maps. She does not control a European sovereign wealth fund." But as Ryder watched the red tickers scroll across his terminal, a cold, suffocating dread seized his chest. It started with a seemingly minor notification. Valois Sovereign Trust initiates total divestment. Within 3 minutes, the dominoes began to fall. The Valois Sovereign Trust, a deeply secretive but astronomically powerful entity operating out of Geneva, did not just pull their direct investments from Prescott Global. They executed a coordinated withdrawal from every single private equity firm, hedge fund, and international bank that held Prescott debt. At 8:22 a.m., Ryder's private line rang. It was the head of global credit at J.P. Morgan. Ryder. The voice on the other end was clipped, devoid of its usual golf buddy warmth. "We're calling in the margin loan on your Pacific shipping fleet." "You can't do that, David," Ryder snapped, his hand gripping the edge of his mahogany desk. "We have a 60-day grace period, and our quarterly earnings are solid. You have no grounds." "I have 80 billion reasons, Ryder," David replied coldly. "The Valois Group just informed us that if we maintain our exposure to Prescott Global, they will pull their entire European liquidity portfolio from our bank. That's $12 billion in cash deposits walking out the door by noon. I'm sorry, you have 24 hours to produce $400 million in collateral, or we seize the ships." The line went dead. Before Ryder could process the betrayal, the phone rang again. It was Goldman Sachs, then Morgan Stanley, then the syndication team at Credit Suisse. By 9:30 a.m., the stock of Prescott Global, a publicly traded logistics behemoth, was in free fall. Panic selling had triggered automatic circuit breakers on the New York Stock Exchange, halting trading of the stock entirely. In less than 2 hours, $1 billion in market capitalization had evaporated into thin air. Across the city, in a sprawling multi-level penthouse overlooking Central Park, Declan Prescott woke up with a pounding headache and a mouth that tasted like ash. He had spent the weekend in a state of catatonic denial, drinking top-shelf bourbon and ignoring the frantic texts from his friends, the same friends who had mocked Sophie just days prior. He stumbled into his expansive living room, grabbing his phone. He dialed Sophie's number for the 100th time. "We're sorry. The number you have reached has been permanently disconnected." "Damn it!" Declan hurled the phone across the room, watching it shatter against a marble pillar. His front door chimed. His mother, Veronica, stormed into the penthouse, her face pale, her usual immaculate blowout looking slightly frayed. She wasn't wearing her signature diamonds. She looked small, terrified. "Turn on the news," she ordered, her voice trembling. Declan picked up a remote and turned on the massive television mounted on the wall. The CNBC anchor's voice filled the room, accompanied by a glaring red graphic that read, "Prescott Global on brink of collapse." A stunning turn of events this morning as one of America's largest shipping empires faces a catastrophic liquidity crisis. Sources indicate a massive coordinated divestment by European institutional investors has effectively severed Prescott Global's access to credit. Analysts are calling it an unprecedented financial execution. "Dad can fix this," Declan muttered, though his voice lacked any conviction. "He always fixes this. Your father just had a mild coronary episode and is being airlifted to Mount Sinai," Veronica snapped, tears of pure rage and panic welling in her eyes. "The board of directors is holding an emergency vote to oust him as CEO. Our accounts at Citibank have been frozen pending a collateral review. Do you understand what this means, Declan?" Veronica walked up to him, grabbing the lapels of his silk robe. "We are ruined. Everything we have is leveraged against the company's stock. The Hamptons house, this penthouse, the private jets. It's all collateral." She shook him, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You had a billionaire princess in the palm of your hand, and you let her slip away because you wanted to look cool in front of Brooks and Carter." Declan felt the room spin. The reality of his arrogance was crashing down upon him with the weight of a falling skyscraper. Sophie hadn't just left him, she had systematically dismantled the very foundation of his identity. I'll go to her, Declan said, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. I'll fly to Laurent. I'll apologize. She loved me, Mom. I know she did. I can make her stop this. Veronica looked at him, a bitter, cynical laugh escaping her lips. She is a sovereign ruler, Declan. You think you can just knock on the door of a castle? But go beg. It's the only play we have left. 3,000 miles away, the air in the sovereign duchy of Laurent was crisp, smelling of pine needles and ancient stone. The motorcade of armored Mercedes-Benz S-Class sedans wound its way up the treacherous, winding mountain road toward the Château de Valois, a sprawling, imposing fortress that had stood for 800 years. Inside the liad vehicle, Princess Sophia Isabella Valois stared out the tinted window. She had stripped off the altered salmon-pink dress on the private jet. She was now dressed in a tailored charcoal gray Chanel suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. Your Highness, Chancellor Frederick said softly, from the seat opposite hers, reviewing a leather-bound dossier. The financial maneuvers against the Prescott family have been executed flawlessly. Wall Street has reacted exactly as we modeled. Good, Sophie replied, her tone devoid of any triumph or joy. It was purely business. Ensure the holding company buys up their distressed debt through blind proxies. I want complete control of their board by the end of the month. Yes, Your Highness. Frederick paused, looking at her with a mixture of immense respect and paternal concern. If I may, are you all right? Sophie turned her gaze from the majestic, snow-capped Alps to the Chancellor. She thought of Declan. She thought of the way his eyes had shifted, the way he had so easily discarded her humanity to protect his fragile ego. The pain of the betrayal had been searing, a sharp knife to the chest, but during the 6-hour flight across the Atlantic, the pain had metastasized into something far more dangerous, a cold, impenetrable resolve. I am perfectly fine, Frederick, she said smoothly. My time in New York was educational. I learned how the new money operates. They are driven by ego and insecurity. They mistake cruelty for power and wealth for class. It is a weakness that is remarkably easy to exploit. The motorcade passed through the massive wrought iron gates of the chateau, pulling into the cobblestone courtyard. A line of palace staff, dressed in immaculate livery, bowed in perfect unison as Sophie stepped out of the vehicle. She did not stop to greet them. She walked with rapid, purposeful strides through the cavernous entrance hall, beneath ancient tapestries and portraits of her ancestors, straight toward the medical wing. Grand Duke Maximilien Valois, the Lion of Laurent, looked smaller than she remembered. He lay in a massive 4-poster bed, hooked to a series of monitors that beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. His face was pale, his silver hair thin, but his eyes, the exact same dark, piercing eyes as Sophie's, sparkled with sharp intelligence as she entered the room. Sophia, he breathed, a faint smile touching his lips. Grandfather, she whispered, the cold royal veneer finally cracking as she rushed to his bedside, taking his frail, paper-thin hand in hers. You came back, he said, his voice raspy. I heard you made quite an exit from America. Sophie offered a small, sad smile. I fear I left a rather messy footprint in Manhattan, grandfather. The old Duke chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. The Prescotts, yes, Frederick briefed me. Vile, grasping people. You did well to crush them. A ruler must never allow disrespect to go unanswered, lest the wolves think the shepherd has grown weak. He squeezed her hand, his expression turning solemn. My time is short, my child. The doctors speak of weeks, perhaps days. The Regency Council will try to test you. They will look at your 2 years playing commoner and assume you are soft. Count Ethans von Reichenbach is already maneuvering. He claims a woman who served coffee and repaired library books cannot manage the duchy's global portfolio. Sophie's jaw tightened. Count Ethan's was her second cousin, a pompous, deeply traditional man who believed the throne belonged to him by right of gender and age. "Let him underestimate me," Sophie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I know exactly how to handle men who think I am beneath them." 2 days later, Sophie stood at the head of the massive obsidian table in the council chamber. The room was circular, lined with ancient books, and lit by a massive iron chandelier. The 12 members of the Regency Council sat in heavily carved chairs, watching her with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and, in the case of Count Ethan's, open disdain. Ethan's leaned back in his chair, tapping a solid gold pen against the table. "Your Highness," Ethan's began, his tone patronizing, "we are thrilled you have returned from your little sabbatical in the States. However, with the Grand Duke incapacitated, the financial stewardship of the Valois Trust requires a seasoned hand. I propose the Council grant me temporary executive authority over the global portfolio. The markets are volatile, and frankly, repairing antique bindings does not prepare one for macroeconomic warfare." A few council members murmured in agreement. Sophie did not sit. She stood at the head of the table, projecting absolute dominance. She opened a slender manila folder and slid a dozen copies of a heavily redacted document down the polished black stone table. "Count Ethan's," Sophie said, her voice ringing clear and cold in the chamber. "While you were busy attending polo matches in Dubai last week, assuming I was nothing more than a librarian, I was orchestrating a hostile takeover of Prescott Global." The murmurs instantly stopped. Ethan's frowned, picking up the document. "By leveraging our threat of withdrawal from 4 major American banks," Sophie continued, pacing slowly behind her chair, "I triggered a liquidity crisis that devalued Prescott's stock by 70% in 48 hours. Through 3 shell corporations operating out of Luxembourg, we have been aggressively purchasing their distressed debt. And as of this morning, the Sovereign Duchy of Lorraine is the majority creditor of Prescott Global." She stopped pacing and locked eyes with Ethan's, who was now staring at the paperwork, his face draining of color. "We bought a $2 billion logistics infrastructure for pennies on the dollar," Sophie concluded. "I plan to liquidate their poorly managed assets, integrate their European shipping lanes into our own holding companies, and turn a profit of approximately 400 million euros by the end of the quarter." She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, her dark eyes blazing with an intimidating fire. "So, Count Ethan's," she purred, the threat heavily veiled but unmistakable. "Do you still believe I require a seasoned hand to manage our portfolio? Or are you quite finished insulting your future sovereign?" The silence in the room was absolute. Ethan swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. He slowly put the gold pen down and bowed his head. "I retract my proposal, Your Highness," he muttered. "The portfolio is yours." Sophie sat down in the heavy, high-backed chair at the head of the table. "Excellent. Now let us review the quarterly tax yields from the Geneva sector." The archivist was dead. The Queen had arrived. 2 weeks is an eternity in the world of high finance. For the Prescott family, it was a rapid, agonizing descent into hell. Prescott Global had officially filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection. Ryder Prescott, recovering from his heart attack, had been unceremoniously ousted by the board. Their assets were frozen. The penthouse was in foreclosure. Veronica had been quietly asked to resign from her charities, and her country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues. The high society friends who had drunk their champagne and laughed at their jokes now treated them like lepers. Desperation breeds humiliation. Declan Prescott stood shivering in the biting wind outside the towering wrought iron gates of the Château de Valois. He was not wearing his custom vicuña wool suit. He wore a wrinkled trench coat, his hair unkempt, his eyes rimmed with red. He had flown commercial, coach for the first time in his life, to Geneva and taken a public bus to the edge of the duchy. He had been standing at the security gate for 4 hours. The heavily armed guards of the Royal Guard, resplendent in their midnight blue uniforms, ignored him completely, treating him with the exact same indifference one might show a stray dog. "Please," Declan begged the stoic guard at the intercom for the 5th time. "Just tell her Declan is here. Just tell her I need to speak to her, please." Finally, the intercom buzzed. The guard listened to an earpiece, his expression unreadable. He turned to Declan. "Her Royal Highness will grant you exactly 5 minutes. Empty your pockets. Step through the metal detector." Declan was thoroughly searched, his phone confiscated, before he was escorted by 2 armed guards up the long, sweeping driveway. He was not taken through the grand main entrance. He was led through a side door, down a labyrinth of stone corridors, and finally into a massive, echoing chamber that served as the Duke's private audience room. The room was intimidating by design. Towering, arched windows let in the cold mountain light, casting long shadows across the black marble floor. At the far end of the room, seated behind an immense, intricately carved oak desk, was Sophie. She was flanked by Chancellor Frederick and 2 more armed guards. She did not look up as Declan was brought to a halt 10 feet away from her desk. She was signing documents with a heavy, gold fountain pen. "Sophie," Declan breathed, his voice cracking. He took a step forward, but the guards immediately crossed their halberds, blocking his path. "That is Her Royal Highness to you, Mr. Prescott," Chancellor Frederick barked. Sophie held up a single manicured hand. Frederick fell silent. She finished signing the document, placed the pen down, and finally looked up. Declan felt his breath catch. The woman looking at him was a stranger. The soft, gentle archivist who used to laugh at his jokes and make him coffee in her tiny apartment was entirely gone. In her place was a monarch, cold, untouchable, and radiating an overwhelming aura of power. "You have 4 minutes, Declan," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any anger, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the tone of someone addressing an annoyance. "Sophie, please," Declan pleaded, tears springing to his eyes. He dropped the arrogant playboy facade completely. He was terrified. "You have to stop this. My dad is in the hospital. My mom is having a nervous breakdown. The company is gone. We're losing everything. We're going to be on the street. Your father's health is unfortunate, but stress is a known risk factor in corporate mismanagement." Sophie replied clinically. "As for your financial situation, I fail to see how that is the concern of the crown." "Because you loved me," Declan shouted, his voice echoing off the stone thresholds. "I know you did. And I loved you. I was stupid, okay? I was an idiot. I let my mother get in my head. I let Brooks and Carter pressure me. I was weak. But you don't have to destroy my family over a stupid mistake at a party. Please, Sophie, I'm begging you. Call off the banks. Give us our credit back." Sophie stared at him. For a fleeting second, Declan thought he saw a flicker of sympathy in her dark eyes, but it was only a trick of the light. "A mistake," she repeated softly. "A mistake is spilling wine on a rug, Declan. What you did was a revelation of your character. You sat at a table with people you consider your inferiors, and you mocked a woman you claim to love simply to buy the cheap approval of a room full of sycophants." She stood up slowly, leaning her hands on the desk. "You did not love me, Declan. You loved the idea of saving a poor girl. You loved the power dynamic. You loved having a pet you could dress up and parade around to prove how benevolent you were. And the moment that pet embarrassed you in front of your masters, you threw her to the wolves." "That's not true," Declan sobbed, dropping to his knees on the hard marble floor. It was a pathetic sight, the golden boy of Manhattan groveling in the dust. I'll do anything. I'll sign a prenup. I'll leave my family. Just please give the company back. Sophie sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. She picked up the document she had just been signing and gestured for Chancellor Frederick to take it. Frederick walked forward and handed the heavy parchment to Declan. Declan's hands shook as he took it. He looked down through his tears. It was a transfer of deed. What is this? He stammered. That is the final nail in the coffin of Prescott Global, Sophie said coldly. At 9 a.m. this morning, the bankruptcy court approved the sale of Prescott Global's remaining viable assets to the highest bidder to satisfy its creditors. The Valois Sovereign Trust was the highest bidder. We did not just ruin your company, Declan. We bought it. Declan stopped breathing. His eyes darted across the page, reading the legalese that confirmed his absolute destruction. We own the ships. We own the warehouses. We own the intellectual property, Sophie continued, her voice echoing like a judge reading a death sentence. And as the new majority owner, my first executive action was to terminate the entire executive board, void all golden parachutes, and liquidate the Prescott name from the corporate registry. Prescott Global no longer exists. You took everything, Declan whispered, the parchment slipping from his trembling fingers. I took exactly what you valued most, Sophie corrected him. You showed me that money and status were the only things that mattered in your world, so I removed them. Consider it a lesson in humility, the very thing you accuse me of needing. She sat back down, picking up her pen to review the next file. Your 5 minutes are up, Mr. Prescott. You may walk back to the bus stop. I believe the public transit schedule in Geneva is quite reliable. Far more reliable than a Prescott. Sophie, wait, you can't. Remove him, she ordered, not looking up. The two guards immediately seized Declan by the armpits, hauling him roughly to his feet. He thrashed, crying out her name, begging, screaming apologies, but his voice grew fainter and fainter as they dragged him down the long stone corridor. Sophie sat in the deafening silence of the great hall. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing Declan Prescott from her life forever. She looked down at her right hand, her thumb gently brushing the rough, dark sapphire of the sovereign ring. She had found her crown, and in doing so, she had learned exactly how heavy it was meant to be. The sound of the auctioneer's gavel echoing through the empty, cavernous halls of the Prescott estate in the Hamptons sounded exactly like a coffin being nailed shut. It was a bleak, overcast Tuesday in November. 4 months after the catastrophic collapse of Prescott Global, the federal bankruptcy courts had not been kind, because Ryder Prescott had brazenly cross-collateralized his personal assets to desperately float the company's sinking stock during that fatal Monday morning margin call. The banks had seized everything. Declan stood in the driveway, wearing a plain, off-the-rack dark jacket he had bought from a discount department store. He watched as men in gray jumpsuits carried his mother's prized possessions out the front door, a 19th-century French chandelier, a set of customized Louis Vuitton steamer trunks, the grand Steinway piano that had sat in the foyer, an instrument no one in the family actually knew how to play, but which looked appropriately expensive. They can't take the Matisse. Tell them they cannot take the Matisse Ryder. Veronica's voice was a shrill, hysterical shriek. Declan turned to see his mother standing on the pristine lawn, physically trying to wrestle a framed painting away from a massive, impassive repo man. Veronica was a ghost of the terrifying socialite she had been 6 months ago. The diamonds were gone, seized by the liquidators. Her hair was pulled back in a frantic, messy knot. The stress had aged her a decade. Let it go, Veronica, Ryder rasped, leaning heavily on a cane. The heart attack had permanently robbed him of his booming, tyrannical energy. He looked like a hollowed-out shell, his skin a sickly gray. It's gone. It's all gone. The repo man gently but firmly pried the painting from Veronica's hands, and loaded it into the back of a sprawling Vanguard logistics truck. Declan felt a sick, twisted knot in his stomach when he saw the logo. Vanguard Logistics was a subsidiary of the Valois Sovereign Trust. Sophie wasn't just taking their things, she was using her own trucks to haul them away. Desperation had driven Declan to the darkest corners of his pride over the last 16 weeks. After being thrown out of the Chateau de Valois, he had returned to New York, convinced he could leverage his network to bounce back. He was a Prescott. He went to Ivy League schools. He belonged to the right clubs. But high society is a ruthless ecosystem that instinctively purges the weak. When Declan had called his best friend, Brooks, the same Brooks who had laughed at Sophie's sapphire ring, the call went straight to voicemail. When he finally cornered Carter at a members-only cigar lounge in Manhattan, Carter had physically recoiled, waving over a bouncer. "Look, Deck," Carter had said, adjusting his bespoke silk tie, avoiding eye contact. "My dad's firm does a lot of sovereign wealth management. The Valois Group sent out a very quiet, very terrifying memo. Anyone who does business with you, anyone who hires you, anyone who even extends you a line of credit gets blacklisted by the duchy. I can't be seen with you, man. I'm sorry. You're radioactive." They were utterly isolated. The friends who had drunk their vintage champagne and laughed at their cruel jokes had evaporated like morning mist. With his bank accounts frozen and his credit score reduced to ash, Declan had been forced into the unthinkable, manual labor. He was currently working as a night shift inventory clerk at a brutalist, fluorescent-lit pharmaceutical warehouse in New Jersey. The man who used to fly private to Monaco for the weekend now spent 8 hours a day scanning barcodes on boxes of generic aspirin, earning $22 an hour just to keep his parents in a cramped, 2-bedroom rental in Queens. "Declan," Veronica snapped, shaking him from his grim reverie. "Do something. Call Genevieve. The Sinclair family has billions. They can bridge us a loan. She always loved you." Declan let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Genevieve Sinclair got engaged to a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley 3 weeks ago, Mom. I saw it on Instagram. She blocked me right after." "Then sell the ring," Veronica screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at him. "The diamond you gave that wretched European witch, you said she gave it back. It's a 10-carat flawless diamond, Declan. It's worth at least $3 million. Sell it." Declan froze. He slowly reached into the pocket of his cheap jacket, his fingers wrapping around the small velvet box he carried with him everywhere as a miserable reminder of his colossal stupidity. I can't," Declan whispered, looking at the gravel driveway. "Why not?" his mother demanded, her voice breaking. "I tried," Declan confessed, the shame burning his throat. "I took it to a diamond broker in the Diamond District last week. I needed cash to pay Dad's medical bills." "And?" Ryder wheezed, his eyes widening with a desperate, pathetic hope. "What did they say?" Declan pulled the box out and snapped it open. The massive, glittering stone caught the gray light. "The broker put it under a loop," Declan said, his voice trembling. "Then he ran it through a thermal conductivity tester. It's not real." Veronica stared at him, uncomprehending. "What do you mean it's not real? You bought it from De Beers." "I did," Declan said, a tear finally spilling over his lash line. "But the night of the gala, when Sophie dropped it in my champagne glass, she didn't drop the real ring." He remembered the way she had looked at him, the utter coldness in her eyes. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had a master jeweler swap the stone for cubic zirconia before the party. Declan choked out. "She knew exactly who we were. She knew what I was going to do. She took the $3 million diamond, Mom. She took it and she left me a piece of glass because she knew we would need the money and she wanted to make sure we couldn't use it." Veronica's knees finally buckled. She collapsed onto the gravel, burying her face in her hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail of total defeat. Ryder leaned against his cane, staring blankly at the house that was no longer his. Declan looked down at the piece of worthless glass in his hand. Princess Sophia Isabella Valois had not just defeated them. She had orchestrated their demise with the precision of a master chess player, anticipating every move, stripping them of their wealth, their friends, and finally, their last ounce of hope. The great bells of the Cathedral of Saint Jean-Baptiste in Geneva tolled with a deep, mournful resonance that vibrated in the marrow of the bones. Grand Duke Maximilian Valois was dead. The state funeral was a global spectacle, broadcast to millions, a solemn display of ancient power and modern political gravity. The front rows of the cathedral were occupied by the true masters of the world, the President of France, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Chancellor of Switzerland, and the secretive heads of the world's largest banking syndicates. Walking behind the mahogany casket, draped in the roaring lion flag of the duchy, was Sophie. She wore a floor-length black mourning gown, a veil of delicate black lace obscuring the upper half of her face. Around her neck rested the Valois star, a priceless, historic diamond collar worn only by the reigning monarch. Her posture was rigidly perfect, a stoic statue of grief and duty. As they laid her grandfather to rest in the family crypt beneath the cathedral, Sophie felt a profound, crushing weight settle upon her shoulders. The 2 years of freedom in America felt like a distant, hazy dream. The archivist, named Sophie Bennett, was buried in that crypt alongside the Grand Duke. Only Her Serene Highness, Grand Duchess Sophia, remained. But there was no time to mourn. The vultures were already circling. 3 days after the funeral, the mourning period was officially interrupted by an emergency session of the Regency Council. Sophie sat at the head of the obsidian table, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, her expression unreadable. Count Ethans von Reichenbach stood at the opposite end of the table, flanked by 4 older, deeply conservative members of the council. Ethans looked smug, exuding the dangerous confidence of a man who believed he held a winning hand. "Your Serene Highness," Ethans began, his voice dripping with faux deference. "We mourn the loss of the Grand Duke deeply, but the stability of the sovereign trust cannot be compromised by sentimentality. The global markets are shifting, the tech sector is volatile, and quite frankly, the international banking community is nervous about a 26-year-old unmarried woman holding sole executive control over an $80 billion portfolio." "Are they nervous, Count Ethans?" Sophie asked mildly, steepling her fingers. "Or are you nervous? I speak for the financial security of Laurent," Ethans countered smoothly, "which is why I have invoked Article 14 of the Duchy's founding charter." A ripple of tension swept through the room. Chancellor Frederick, standing beside Sophie, stiffened. Article 14 was an archaic, deeply sexist 16th century law. It stipulated that if a female heir ascended to the throne without a royal consort, a husband of equal noble standing, the Regency Council could mandate a marriage to secure the geopolitical alliances of the state. If the monarch refused, the council could force a vote of no confidence and temporarily seize the financial levers of the trust. "You are invoking a law that hasn't been utilized since 1742, Sophie stated, her voice dangerously calm. "I am acting within the legal framework of our Constitution." Ethans smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "We have taken the liberty of arranging a highly advantageous match. Prince Leopold of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He is 32, financially literate, and his family holds massive real estate assets across Austria and Germany. You will marry him by the end of the year, or the council will officially freeze your executive authority over the sovereign trust." It was a brilliant, vicious coup. Ethans knew she would never submit to a forced marriage, which meant she would forfeit control of the money. And without the money, the Grand Duchess of Laurent was merely a figurehead in a museum. "You would force me to marry a stranger, to maintain your grip on my family's wealth," Sophie said, looking at the 5 men standing against her. "It is the burden of the crown, Your Highness," Ethan's mocked softly. "Duty before self." Sophie did not yell. She did not panic. She simply smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that made the hairs on the back of Chancellor Frederick's neck stand up. "Chancellor," Sophie said without looking away from Ethan's, "please distribute the BlackRock merger documents." Frederick opened a heavy leather briefcase and began passing thick, bound dossiers down the table. Ethan's frowned, picking up his copy. As his eyes scanned the first page, the smug arrogance completely vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, breathless horror. What have you done?" Ethan's choked out. "I have been busy since I returned from New York," Sophie said, leaning forward. "You thought my acquisition of Prescott Global was a petty act of personal revenge. It was not. It was a strategic acquisition of North American logistics." She stood up, pacing slowly behind her chair. "While you were busy digging through centuries-old law books to find a way to chain me to a Habsburg, I was quietly negotiating a silent partnership with the Vanguard Group and BlackRock. I leveraged the Prescott shipping fleet to secure a hostile takeover of Euro-Rail freight. Yesterday afternoon, I merged the 2 entities." Ethan's was sweating now. The other council members were furiously flipping through the documents, their eyes wide with shock. "The Sovereign Duchy of Lorraine now controls 60% of all commercial freight moving between North America and Western Europe," Sophie declared, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "I haven't just protected the portfolio count, Ethan's. I have increased the trust's valuation by $22 billion in a single quarter." She stopped pacing and stared directly into Ethan's terrified eyes. "Furthermore," Sophie continued, her tone turning lethal, "the merger is structured under a new holding company registered in Delaware, entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Regency Council. I am the sole commanding shareholder. If you attempt to freeze my authority, the new holding company will instantly liquidate the council's private pension funds to cover the restructuring debt. I will personally bankrupt every single one of you." Silence reigned in the chamber. It was absolute, suffocating, and total. "So," Sophie whispered, sitting back down in her chair, "let us talk about Article 14, Count Ethan's. Are we planning a wedding?" Ethan swallowed hard, looking at the 4 men who had backed him. They were staring at their files, refusing to meet his gaze. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and completely broken by a woman they thought they could easily control. "No, Your Serene Highness," Ethan's whispered, his voice trembling. There will be no wedding. The council formally withdraws the petition." "Excellent," Sophie said coldly. "You are dismissed from my presence, all of you." As the men scrambled out of the chamber, utterly humiliated, Chancellor Frederick looked at his new sovereign. He saw the iron in her spine, the brilliant, ruthless intellect in her eyes. The Lion of Lorraine was dead, but the lioness had taken the throne, and the world was about to learn just how fiercely she could roar. 5 years pass in the blink of an eye when you are shaping the future of global commerce. 5 years drag like 1,000 centuries when you are paying for the sins of your past. It was late January, and the frozen, snow-swept town of Davos, Switzerland was playing host to the World Economic Forum. The most powerful politicians, billionaires, and tech titans on the planet had gathered to discuss the global economy, climate initiatives, and international policy. The crown jewel of the week was the Sovereign Summit Gala, an ultra-exclusive, closed-door charity dinner held at a heavily fortified luxury resort carved into the side of the Alps. Security was so tight that even the private security details of billionaires were forced to wait outside. Inside the grand hall, the atmosphere was electric. The keynote speaker for the evening had just finished her address, and the room was buzzing with a standing ovation. Grand Duchess Sophia. Isabella Valois stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of applause. At 31, she was a true titan. Forbes had recently named her the most powerful woman in European finance. She was dressed in a breathtaking, custom-tailored emerald green velvet gown, a subtle, modern diamond tiara woven into her dark hair. She radiated an effortless, terrifying perfection. She stepped down from the podium, immediately flanked by the French finance minister and the CEO of a massive American tech conglomerate, both of them eagerly hanging on her every word. She navigated the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, offering polite smiles, and securing billions of dollars in charitable commitments with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Across the room, standing rigidly against the wall near the kitchen doors, stood a waiter. He wore a crisp white shirt, a black bow tie, and a dark vest. He held a silver tray of empty champagne flutes. His hands, once soft and perfectly manicured, were rough and calloused. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was etched with the permanent, exhausted lines of a man who had spent half a decade working grueling, invisible jobs just to survive. Declan Prescott watched the Grand Duchess move through the crowd. He couldn't look away. It felt like a physical blow to his chest every time she smiled. He remembered the smell of her shampoo in that tiny apartment in Brooklyn. He remembered the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes when they ate cheap takeout on her sofa. He remembered the woman who had loved him for him before he threw her into the fire for the amusement of people who didn't even remember his name. His life in New York had completely collapsed. After his father passed away from a second fatal heart attack, his mother had moved to Florida to live in a cramped trailer park with her sister, completely detached from reality. Declan had fled the States, taking a job with an international luxury catering agency simply because it offered room and board. He spent his life serving the exact demographic of people he used to belong to, a ghost haunting the halls of high society. "Hey, table 4 needs clearing." A sharp voice hissed in his ear. The catering manager nudged Declan hard in the ribs. "Stop staring at the royalty and do your job, Prescott. If you drop a glass tonight, you're fired." "Right, sorry," Declan muttered, adjusting his grip on the silver tray. He walked out onto the floor, weaving invisibly through the billionaires. He approached table 4, keeping his head down, meticulously gathering empty plates and glasses. Suddenly, the crowd parted. The entourage of security and dignitaries swept past his table. Declan froze, instinctively taking a step back, holding the heavy silver tray against his chest like a shield. Grand Duchess Sophia stopped directly across the table from him. She was speaking to the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, discussing supply chain logistics in sub-Saharan Africa. As she spoke, she reached out blindly to set her half-empty crystal water glass on the table. Her hand brushed the edge of Declan's silver tray. The motion caused her to pause. She turned her head, looking up at the waiter holding the tray. Time stopped. The loud, buzzing chatter of the Billionaire gala faded into absolute roaring silence in Declan's ears. Sophie looked at him. Her dark eyes swept over his cheap catering uniform, the heavy bags under his eyes, the graying hair at his temples. She saw the total, utter destruction of the golden boy of Manhattan. She saw the man who had laughed at her while his friends tore her apart. Declan's breath hitched. He felt his face burn. With a shame so profound, it made him want to sink into the floor and disappear forever. He opened his mouth, his throat working dryly. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to say he thought about her every single day. He wanted to say that losing her was the only tragedy that actually mattered. Sophie. His lips formed the word, though no sound came out. Sophie stared at him for 3 Agonizing seconds. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was no petty satisfaction of seeing her enemy brought low. There was absolutely nothing. Her eyes were completely, terrifyingly blank, as if she were looking at a mildly interesting piece of furniture. She didn't recognize him. Or worse, she simply didn't care enough to acknowledge that she did. Without a flicker of emotion, she placed her crystal glass onto his tray with a soft clink. "Thank you," she murmured politely, not looking at him again, immediately turning back to the CEO to finish her sentence about vaccine distribution routes. She swept past him, her emerald gown brushing lightly against his black trousers, leaving behind the faint, haunting scent of her expensive perfume. Declan stood frozen, holding the tray. A single tear slipped down his cheek, landing on the rim of the crystal glass she had just discarded. He watched her walk away, surrounded by power and light. A queen ruling a world he was no longer fit to even step foot in. He finally understood the ultimate punishment for his arrogance. She hadn't just taken his wealth. She hadn't just taken his status. She had made him entirely, irrevocably irrelevant. Declan wiped the tear from his cheek, tightened his grip on the silver tray, and turned back toward the kitchen doors, disappearing into the shadows where he belonged. Does true karma come from anger or from absolute indifference? Declan learned the hard way that the most devastating revenge isn't destroying someone. It's moving on and becoming so incredibly successful that they no longer even register in your world. Sophie didn't just break the glass ceiling. She bought the building and evicted the people who tried to keep her down. If you loved watching a fake prince get dethroned by a real queen, smash that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never judge a book by its humble cover, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another dramatic tale of high society karma. Let us know in the comments, do you think Declan deserved his miserable fate, or was the Grand Duchess too harsh?